Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kedato Vande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murtna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Siva Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Gadai Shila Tahate Na Huido Morachita Jeba Nahi Bhuji Keba Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajive Priti Janivera Serariti Shunile Borohohit Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Muda Chintyatam Bhaktas Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, Shri Raghunath, and Shri Jiva, Shri Krishna Das Kaviraja Gosvami Pad, a playful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Gaura Lila, from which the very essence of the nectar of Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions. Again, today we will absorb ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. So we will resume in Madhya Lila, chapter 22, the Sanatan Shiksha, and we're discussing now we're coming more or less to the conclusion of the discussion as to why Krishna Bhakti is the abhideya, or the principal abhideya, of all of the Shastra. And in the last class we heard this statement about Bhagavan's character, that he will give people whatever they want unless it's something that upon it being given to them will not actually satisfy them and leave them in this situation where they just come back to him again for something else. So he'll give you whatever you want as long as it's good for you, in his estimation of your own good. And in the case of it being something else, then he'll give you what's actually good for you instead of what you want, and that turns out to be himself, or his own feet, or service to him, or simply bhakti. So, whether one takes up the path of bhakti for another purpose, or for that purpose, whatever the case may be, one will end up getting that and that alone, which is interesting in that typically people take up a means to achieve an ends, But bhakti is something unique insofar as it's both a means and an ends. And it's unique in the sense that as a means, it converts those who take it up as a means to something else into, or it forces them to ultimately accept it which they thought was a means as the ultimate end. And this is its greatness, or this is the expression of Bhagavan's grace or ultimate goodwill towards all. So, having discussed this topic in the last class, then there was a reference to, or a mention made in regard to Dhruva Maharaj. And in the commentary, rather, that we discussed, where the distinction was made by Chakravarti Pad between those who take up the path initially with the clarity of performing bhakti for bhakti's sake, in contrast to those who take up the path of bhakti for the sake of achieving something else, using bhakti as only a means, which Jiva Gosvami did describe as a type of aparad towards bhakti. So now the Caitanya-caritamrta looks at the situation of those who take up the path of bhakti for something else, and how they end up forsaking that initial motivation and sticking with bhakti by the grace of Krishna. And how that category of bhaktas doesn't ever achieve the same degree of excellence as those who, from beginning to end, or beginninglessly, engage in bhakti only for bhakti's sake. So that's what we'll discuss today, with a payar and a statement of Dhruva Maharaj, and we'll look at some statements in the Bhagavatam, as well as some commentaries on those verses in the Bhagavatam, as well as discussion of them found in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And all of these things are relevant for sadhakas who may find themselves to still harbor desire for objects other than bhakti. So as we listen to this, it's theory, but it's also, grounds for reflection with respect to fostering a strength of resolve to not further nourish or further ingrain whatever desires or inclinations we may have for other objects into our own, lives, behaviors, psyche, etc. Because, as we'll see in the case of Dhruva, what is the outcome of performing bhakti motivated by those things? Where does the experience, or what is the outcome of behaving that? What does one ultimately experience as a result of performing bhakti with that alloyed motivation? So when we see what Dhruva ultimately goes through as a result of this, it can give us some awareness or call for caution in terms of what we foster within our hearts as really what we want to desire and prioritize in our life. So this is something to hold in mind as we hear what we'll discuss today. Okay, so the file should be available in the box. I assume it's gone through, and I'll start. So this is Payar 41, Madhya 22. Kam lagi Krishna bhaje pai Krishna rase, kam chadi das hoite hoy abhilashe. One who worships Krishna for the sake of a desired object thus attains Krishna rasa. So this is a reference to the statement made earlier that we discussed in the previous class, that one started using bhakti as a means to get something else, but by the purifying power of bhakti itself, one who took up the worship of Krishna for another purpose ultimately achieves Krishna rasa, or Krishna bhakti rasa. One then forsakes the desired object initially sought and acquires the desire to become a servant of Krishna. Or in other words, in the course of engaging in the path of bhakti, there's a reconstitution of the conditioning of the psyche such that the vasana that was initially motivating someone and was prominent is no longer prominent, and the bhakti vasana becomes predominant, within the psyche such that one harbors no interest in anything other than service to Krishna. So the tippani characterizes this within the flow of thought as follows. Quote, if the objection is raised, well, even in the case of Sri Bhagavan bestowing his feet upon even worshippers who do not desire them, as was discussed in the last reading, those bhaktas who were desirous of other objects certainly still have those various inclinations for other objects. So this is the objection. In other words, I can come along and tell a child, well, I'm not going to give you what you want because it's not good for you, I'm going to give you this instead. But the child still wants the other thing, even though they might be told or they might be educated that it's not in their best interest. So you still have to deal with the reality of the way that the child's mind is at that time. So he's saying, similarly, Bhagavan might say, oh, I'm not going to give you what you want, I'm going to give you this instead, but the person is still, the mind is still has the inclination for that other thing. So what's going to happen to the person in that case? So this is the concern that's being raised. So the payar that we just read is the answer to that concern. To that he says no, that is, kama. He states this payar to negate that idea. Those various inclinations or vasanas terminate in servitude to Krishna. In other words, there's an actual reconditioning of the psyche whereby the vasana that was prominent is no longer prominent, the vasana for bhakti becomes prominent. And thus they, that is the bhaktas whose inclinations have thus been terminated, do not have any inclination for anything else anymore. This is the purport. So this is the mind game, so to speak, or this is the psychological field on which the practice of bhakti sadhana plays out. And in one sense is, where the work is to be done or where the effect is to be had. How much happens socially or historically or, in the world, so to speak, is almost irrelevant to the trajectory of an individual jiva, the extent to which there's this transformation or realignment of the functioning in the psyche. This is all important to the sadhaka reaching the state of having actual anubhav or experience of prema, Bhagavan, and so forth, which is the object of this entire path. So, Krishna rasa here in the payar refers to Krishna bhakti rasa. That we've discussed previously, we won't discuss it again at this time, and it'll be elaborated on further in the next chapter. So, here's a citation from the Hari Bhakti Sudodaya, which illustrates the point under discussion. So this is a statement of Dhruva to Bhagavan. Stanabilashi tapasi stitoham tam praptavan deva munindra guyam kacham vichinvaniva dibyaratnam swamin kritartosmi varam nayache. Desirous of a position, I was engaged in austerity, and now I have attained you, who are hidden even from the devas and sages. As though I have attained a divine jewel after searching for a piece of glass. O Swami, I am fulfilled, and I do not beg for any boon. So the context here is that Bhagavan is giving darshan to Dhruva, having been propitiated by his worship, and offering him a boon, knowing very well why he took up this worship and what he was originally interested in achieving. So, Dhruva explains, I did want a kingdom, but now that I've achieved you, now that I've had darshan of you, now I don't want it anymore. That's just like a piece of glass now in comparison to you, who are like a jewel. Or I'm so satisfied perceiving your greatness, magnificence, beauty, quality, etc., that what I thought was worthy of being desired for, I now realize is not worthy of being desired at all. So I don't want that In the least, I'm fully satisfied with this darshan I have of you. This is, in gist, how we can understand this statement. But there's more to what's going on in Dhruva's mind, so we'll look at that in a minute. So I'm going to read here a little bit from, just to give some context to these statements, which, in this case, some understanding of the context is important in order to understand the psychological dynamics that are going on. This verse refers to how Dhruva initially began to worship Sri Bhagavan because he had the desire to attain a kingdom even greater than his father's, after his stepmother forbid him from sitting on his father's lap. So this is all described in the 4th canto. I believe listeners are well acquainted with this narrative, so I'm not going to repeat the whole thing. One can easily look it up if one's not familiar with it. When Sri Bhagavan appeared to Dhruva after he performed 6 months of extremely austere worship, and Dhruva was thus blessed to perceive Sri Bhagavan's personal figure and qualities, Dhruva immediately realized that service to Sri Bhagavan is an attainment vastly superior to sovereignty over any kingdom within the realm of samsara. He thus felt as though the original object for which he had taken up worship of Sri Bhagavan was actually like a mere piece of glass in comparison to the jewel of service to Sri Bhagavan that he now considered the ultimate attainment. Feeling fulfilled just by having the fortune of directly perceiving Sri Bhagavan and realizing this, he did not even pray to Sri Bhagavan for the original object he sought to attain, even when Sri Bhagavan offered him a boon. Now here's the interesting part. Despite Dhruva's not asking, however, Bhagavan still fulfilled Dhruva's original desire by giving him not only a kingdom on earth greater than his father's, but a kingdom in the uppermost region of the universe that remains intact until the time of the final dissolution. That is, the most desirable kingdom one could attain anywhere in the universe. Dhruva's heart had become so greatly attached to Sri Bhagavan after directly perceiving him, however, that even after attaining this most rare and precious kingdom, he did not feel successful or fulfilled. Dhruva's rumination over this is described as follows in Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is very interesting for multiple reasons. Typically, when someone achieves darshan of Bhagavan, this is the peak moment of their life and they become completely fulfilled. So the fact that he has direct darshan of Bhagavan after doing extreme austerities to achieve it, and yet ultimately afterwards feels dejected and unsatisfied, this is peculiar. And moreover, the fact that he wasn't given what he originally wanted, but he was given something that was actually, according to his original estimation, would have been considered beyond his wildest dreams and far greater than anything he could have ever desired. Even though he was given that, still he was feeling dejected and unsatisfied, because in the process of giving that thing that was far greater than what he could have ever desired by the measuring stick or the criterion that he was originally thinking along, by virtue of the experience of having darshan of Bhagavan, his measuring stick or his criterion of value instantaneously got transformed to such an extent that even that thing that would have originally registered as beyond his wildest dreams and so wonderful was now suddenly too low and far unsatisfying than what he at that point realized was truly worthy of aspiration. So, this is discussed in the Bhagavad. I have a number of verses here. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth giving attention to because it's relevant to, as I mentioned, the personal contemplation of a sadhaka who is dealing with the presence of extraneous desires, which is a rather common phenomenon, and is very much to the core of what determines the success of one's practice of the path of bhakti. As we hear that the sadhana is defined as that the goal of which is bhava bhakti, And the principal characteristic of Bhava Bhakti, according to Jiva Gosvami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, is desirousness solely of Bhagavan. So the extent to which one is desirous only of Bhagavan is the extent to which one has reached the goal of one's sadhana, and is itself the goal of one's sadhana. So one's sadhana can be measured by the degree to which that exclusivity of desire for Bhagavan has taken precedence within the psyche. Anyone can look at their own thoughts on a day in and day out basis and get some idea how far they're along in that process. So if they're feeling far from the goal, and they're, on an ongoing basis using their discernment and other, cognitive tools to process and further their intentness upon the desire for bhakti, and to gradually allow, by the purifying force of the process of bhakti, these other desires and attachments to be purged from the mind, then the points that are discussed here are very much relevant to that ongoing application of vivek and reflection in the course of one's thoughts and the flow of daily life. So, in that respect, let's hear how this phenomenon was discussed by Maitreya and Vidura in the Bhagavad. So Maitreya says, even after attaining his desire, that which led him to attaining the service of Vishnu's feet, and because of which his resolve to propitiate Vishnu by means of performing austere worship was extinguished, he returned home not greatly satisfied. And I've given some points here in the brackets throughout, which are pulled from various commentaries. You can see which commentaries are being quoted in the footnotes. Because he then felt that the original resolve for which he had taken up worship of Vishnu was contemptible. So he felt ashamed of his own desire. He felt that what he initially thought was so high, he later came to realize was so low, that he felt that this was a contemptible thing. So Vidura hears this and replies, even after having attained in one birth that supreme abode of gracious Hari, that is, the kingdom in the uppermost region of the material universe, acquired through worship of his feet and most difficult to attain, why did he who was sagacious, that is, able to discern between essence and non-essence and cognizant of the ultimate Purushartha, consider himself as though unsuccessful, that is, to not have had his desires fulfilled? So he was so successful. He did such extreme worship at such a young age, so successfully, and in only 6 months achieved what others don't achieve for many lifetimes, and then still went home thinking, he struck out. Maitreya said, having been struck at heart by the arrows of the words of his stepmother, and remembering them, that is, those arrow-like words at the time of his meeting with Bhagavan, he did not desire mukti. So the word in the Bhagavad is mukti. The commentators say that in this case, the word mukti means bhakti, that is, servants to Sri Bhagavan and the position of being one of his associates, from the Lord of mukti, that is, from Bhagavan, and thereafter felt remorse. So, I don't know about other countries, at least in America, they tell little kids that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me, which is a way of trying to comfort a child who got insulted or who was spoken to harshly by someone. But that doesn't turn out to always be true. And in this case, Dhruva tolerated extreme physical austerity, but the words of his stepmother still were, had pierced his heart to such an extent that they colored even the way that he interacted with Bhagavan when he had the opportunity to desire whatever he so wished. Or in other words, those harsh words, enkindled in him such an intense selfish interest that it colored his destiny so greatly that it even left him, misusing his opportunity in having direct darshan of Bhagavan. So because of this, he felt great remorse. And so here's his reflection. Jiva said, after attaining in 6 months the shade of the feet of he who Sananda and other celibates realized by means of samadhi, only over the course of many births, I went away because of being of separate interest. That is, because my interest was in an object other than Sri Bhagavan, and thus he did not take me with him to his abode right then. So the 4 Kumaras, Sanat, Sananda, etc., other great sages, other great renunciates, may take them many lifetimes of practicing, austerities and meditation and samadhi to achieve what I achieved in just 6 months. But because I had this other motivation for doing what I did, then I wasn't blessed by Bhagavan with prema for him, wasn't blessed by Bhagavan to come to his divine abode right away, wasn't blessed to remain in his company, and so on. So alas, see the mindlessness of I of meager fortune. After having reached the base of the feet of the destroyer of material existence, I begged for what is perishable. And Jiva Gosvami, in his commentary, he makes a play on words here. I begged for a, quote, pada, or position, rather than for the service of his pada, or feet. My mind was polluted by the falling, intolerant devas, that is, by the devas who are inevitably subject to falling from their positions, and intolerant of those who attain something beyond them. Being most wicked, I did not accept the truth of Narada's word when he told me to ignore the harsh remarks of my stepmother that initially motivated me to worship Bhagavan so as to propitiate him for the sake of attaining a kingdom greater than my father's. So it's not that I didn't know better. I received the association of Narada, I received better guidance, but my mind riveted to that blow to my ego and that separate interest that arose from it and led to this situation. Taking shelter in Bhagavan's Maya, and as though asleep, being a seer of difference even in a second reality, that is, seeing a Purushartha other than Sri Bhagavan, and imagining dangers that were not there, as one perceives unrealities and dangers from snakes and tigers in a dream. I suffered from heartache because of an enemy who was my brother. That is, I perceived my own brother to be an enemy, even though he wasn't inimical to me at all. So I was so driven by this selfish desire that I thought I was in this terrible predicament. I thought my own brother was my enemy. I thought my stepmother was my enemy, and all of this, when actually none of that was the case. I only perceived them as such because of this selfish, egotistical interest that I was so attached to. So this was how I became bewildered in Maya, so to speak, or a perceiver of this false reality. That which was requested from Sri Bhagavan by me is useless, like treatment for a dead person. So if someone's already dead, there's no point in giving them medicine. Similarly, what I got, it doesn't do any good for me, because now I have no interest in that. This is his perception. Obviously, Bhagavan has a purpose for giving him this, which is precisely to engulf him in the very repentance he's doing now, which is the fire that burns out the desire that was in his heart. But in his perspective, as he's going through that process, he's thinking, this gift of Bhagavan is useless. After propitiating the self of the universe, the destroyer of material existence, who is difficult to propitiate by means of austerity, I begged for material existence, for an object of enjoyment within the realm of material existence that binds me within it. So in other words, Grita Mayu, the famous, hermeneutic is said that, Gi is life. When something is a prominent cause of another thing, it's spoken of as being equivalent to that. So what he's actually saying, that I begged for material existence, he didn't beg for material existence, his desire was for a kingdom. But he's realizing that that desire for a desirable feature of material existence, that itself is what is binding me in material existence. So my desire for the enjoyment of material existence, that itself is me, inviting upon myself my own bondage. So because it's the cause, it's described as the effect. So why? Because I was devoid of fortune, or I was, in this deluded, attached state. From he who was offering me sovereignty, that is freedom or servitude to himself, honor, that is a kingdom that was a cause of attaining worldly honor, was begged for by me out of foolishness, like unhusked grain is begged for from an emperor by a poor man because of being devoid of merit. So in other words, a foolish or a short-sighted, uneducated person, if they meet an emperor who could give them villages or a lifetime supply of money, and they say, oh, just can you give me a couple kilos of rice or something like this, then people consider the person foolish because they're asking for so little when they're at a source from which they could receive so much. He's saying like that, I had the chance to receive from Bhagavan what Bhagavan himself can give, and I desired just to get some honor in the eyes of these other deluded people within this world. What could be more foolish of me than that? What Sridhara Swami taught, Agya Janata Samanana Sammadam. That, one of the biggest downfalls of the spiritual aspirant is to be deluded by the honor received from the ignorant masses of human society. So whether it's in the form of being honored as being a renunciate or a wise person or a sadhu of some type, or honored as being a proprietor of a kingdom or an authority or what have you, anything that we pursue for the sake of achieving status in the eyes of the ignorant will never be in our good interest. It will always lead to our downfall. So this point he laments upon. So Maitreya said, my dear Vidura, persons like you who delight in the dust of the lotus feet of Mukunda, and whose well-being of mind comes about just by means of that which is attained of its own accord, that is, those who are satisfied with and able to draw benefit from whatever it is they encounter, certainly do not desire any object of the self, that is, any purushartha, other than servitude to him. So you, Vidura, wise persons who are capable of being content with whatever they come across, in other words, who aren't running after some status in the eyes of the ignorant or perturbed by the harsh words of ignorant people, they desire nothing other than the service of Bhagavan. This is wisdom, this is peace, this is happiness, this is well-being, and this is what Dhruva realized the hard way, so to speak. So, Chakravarti, I've got a summary here of a few points that on these 11 or whatever it was verses of the Bhagavatam that I've quoted, then a gist from a couple of them in Chakravarti Pad's commentary, which are specifically relevant to the context here in the Caritamrta, I have gathered. So a few insightful comments of Sri Chakravarti Pad in regard to these verses that pertain to the subject of how a bhakta who initially worships Bhagavan for a material motive, but later relinquishes that by the grace of Bhagavan, are as follows. Dhruva felt remorse and repented, being aware of my previous resolve. Prabhu knows my vice in the form of my self-interested desirousness. So, he's saying this thing that he thought was a noble pursuit and that he would, boldly approach Bhagavan to achieve. Later, he's feeling ashamed that this is like this vice that I have that I can't hide, and that Bhagavan knows very well. Alas, alas, why did I of wicked mind form that resolve? My Prabhu considered my present prayer for bhakti, which I offered after directly perceiving him, merely my deceitfulness. And thus he did not say anything clear in accord with that, and rather granted only a boon in accord with my previous resolve, that is, my previous desire to attain a kingdom greater than my father's. By his mentioning, quote, upon the death of your brother Uttam, in a previous verse, he reminded me also of my previous enviousness of my brother. So he's seeing Bhagavan's remarks as loaded with indications or allusions to his awareness of Dhruva's various vices. In this way, Dhruva's shame, repentance, humility, and disinterest are observed in the 6 verses aforecited, spoken by him. As an emperor grants him, that is, a poor person who unintelligently begs only for something very meager, wealth beyond his desire, so exactly Bhagavan granted me residency in his own abode. Oh, the extremity of my stupidity, and the extent of Bhagavan's graciousness and munificence. Reflecting thus, he became stunned with amazement for a moment. This is the purport. So, there's many, if we look in the Bengali Vaishnav Padyavali, there's many, poems of Vaishnav humility that end on this note of sort of the head smack or the realization of, oh, I'm the cause of my own problems. Deluded myself and perpetuated my own, predicament or ignorance or conditioning or what have you. This is a common theme, if you will. And this is valuable, or this is in a broader sense relishable, because it's by virtue of this capability to perceive one's own faults or perceive one's own deluded state that one can then heal from it, that one can then actively, engage in, favoring and disfavoring thoughts, desires, actions, etc., and the ongoing, flux of life, such that one can, plot a spiritually advantageous course. So this type of realization of one's, here he says, extremity of stupidity, might be painful on some occasion, but ultimately is also a cause of joy and a cause of adoration for Bhagavan in so, kindly dealing with someone so deluded as me. Alright, so I'm going to go into one more important aspect of the verse that's cited here in the Caritamrta, which gives another little angle on what's being discussed here. So in this way, it is shown how one who worships Krishna for the sake of an object other than Krishna eventually relinquishes the inclination that initially motivated one to worship Krishna, and comes to foster the desire for Krishna and his service to such a strong extent that one repents for having previously desired an object other than Krishna. So this, brings home fully the statement here in the Caritamrta that's meant to be explained, or why this verse was cited to justify the point made in the previous payar. This point here of Chakravarti Pad, strikes right to the core of that idea, that the objection was, even if Bhagavan gives them his feet, the people will still want something else. So this is showing, nope, not only do they not want something else, they realize themselves to be extremely stupid for having desired anything else, and extremely blessed and extremely fortunate to have received the grace from Bhagavan, so as to realize the stupidity in desiring that other thing, the vice in desiring that other thing, and the ultimate value in rendering service and being a servant of Bhagavan. So don't worry about the person retaining some other desire. They themselves will, lament that they hadn't long ago purged themselves of that. So, moving on. In Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Sri Rupa Pad refers to Dhruva as a prime example of one of the categories of the bhaktas mentioned by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Srimad Bhagavad Gita. That is, the category of a, quote, seeker of an object, or arta-arti. So in the Gita, Krishna has this verse where he says that 4 types of fortunate people worship me. Arta-arti jigyasu gyani bharatarshava. The person who's in distress, such as Gajendra. This person, the person who wants something in lieu or in exchange for the worship, like Dhruva, who wanted a kingdom. Then the Jigyasu, the inquisitive, such as Shonaka and the other sages who were present at the reciting of the Bhagavatam, and the Gyanis, like the Kumaras. So these are the 4 examples that Rupa Goswami gives of these 4 categories given by Krishna in the Gita. So this category of bhakta, namely the seeker of an object, is explained by Mahaprabhu later when he discusses that topic in his explanation of the Atmarama verse, to be a type of sakama bhakta. And Sri Jiva accordingly glosses the term arta-arti in his commentary on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu to mean one desirous of attaining happiness, or in other words, pleasure for themselves. Sri Sridhar Samipad glosses it as one desirous of objects that are a means to enjoyment either here or hereafter. And Sri Chakravarti Pad explains it as a seeker of objects of enjoyment here or hereafter, such as property, elephants, horses, women, and gold. So in other words, persons who are seeking something of the world, be it in the direct empiric plane of the world we live in today, or be it Svarga or some other loka within the Brahmanda as described in the Shastra. Persons who are seeking some object therein as a result of their performance of worship, they're called an arta-arti. So Sri Rupa goes on to explain in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that it is only when an arta-arti bhakta such as Dhruva receives the grace of Bhagavan or his bhakta, and thereby gives up the original desire for which they began to worship Bhagavan, that such a bhakta becomes a bearer of eligibility, or adhikari, for pure bhakti. So Rupa Goswami in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, he's not talking about bhakti in general, but uttama bhakti, which he defines as anyabilashita shunya, or being free from desirousness of anything other than bhakti. So all these categories of bhaktas that are mentioned or accepted as these persons that are accepted as bhaktas by Krishna in the Gita, Rupa Goswami says, nope, none of them are uttam bhaktas. But any of them can be if they get the appropriate sadhu sangha, if they acquire the characteristics of a bearer of eligibility for this path. In other words, if they acquire conviction in the Shastra, if they acquire understanding of Uttama Bhakti as the ultimate goal, and if they acquire the sufficient degree of Chitta Shuddhi or purification of the psyche, such that they can actually follow the path. In 40-something verses of the second chapter of the Sindhu, crunch, and you get those 3 points as how the adhikari is defined. But soon here in this chapter of the Sanatana Shiksha, we'll go much more into detail on that topic, so I won't elaborate further on that. In any case, the simple point here is that Dhruva was not an Uttam Bhakta, he was an Arta-arti Bhakta. And it's only in his case, when he got the darshan of Bhagavan and the grace of Bhagavan, that he had a change of heart, if you will, to the point where he acquired the mentality that made him then embark upon specifically Uttam Bhakti rather than the Sakam Bhakti that he was engaging in previously. Sri Chakravarti Pad specifies in his commentary on this verse that it was by the grace of Bhagavan that Dhruva experienced an initial slight degree of Bhagavan's sweetness, became desirous of this specifically, that is, of attaining it in full, and then forsook his desire for a kingdom and became a pure bhakta. So, now we'll look at one more point. Sri Rupapad also cites the verse under discussion. So this verse from the Hari Bhakti Suddhodaya, which is what all this commentary is upon, is also cited directly by Rupa Goswami later in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. And the purpose and the way that he draws out the meaning is quite interesting. So what is the context? He cites this as an illustration of the Sthayi Bhav of a subcategory of the Danavir Rasa form of Vira Bhakti Rasa. That is, the form of the Bhakti Rasa of fortitude found in one who is valiant in the context of receiving gifts. I know this sounds a little strange. Usually we think of someone valiant as like a knight on a battlefield or something like that. But it'll become clear from the definition. So he refers to this particular category as the upastit durapa-arta tyagi, or a renouncer of an occasioned difficult to attain object. So, quote, one by whom a boon such as sharshti is not desired to be accepted, even when being granted by Hari out of satisfaction with the prospective recipient, is called a renouncer of an occasioned difficult to attain object. So, valiance can be shown by great pursuit of an object, but valiance can also be shown by rejection of an object. In other words, if someone is given something or offered something that others might consider to be incredibly valuable or incredibly rare, an incredibly great opportunity, but the person shows disinterest even in that, or conceives of their own well-being, conceives of their own interest as something even greater or beyond that, that also is recognized as a type of valiance or greatness or fortitude on the part of the person. So that's the dynamic that's being referred to here, and Dhruva is illustrating that. So Sri Jiva explains in his commentary on this verse that a, quote, renouncer of an occasioned difficult to attain object, this is the technical term that Rupa Gosvami coins, does not refer to a Siddha Bhakta who has had full experience of Bhagavan's sweetness, but rather to a sadhaka in whom taste for bhakti has manifested somewhat, and who is thus possessed of firm insistence upon the goal of bhakti. Which is to say that such a bhakta is not like one who rejects gur and the like after having attained a taste of nectar, as is the case with a Siddha Bhakta, but rather is a bhakta whose one-pointed insistence upon bhakti has been observed by Sri Hari. And being pleased with that, Sri Hari sometimes ventures as though to give boons to that bhakta that are readily accepted by others, for the purpose of manifesting that bhakta's insistence, that is, showing how that bhakta is one pointed upon the goal of bhakti and genuinely disinterested in other objects. So, what's interesting here is how he's saying that this is not the case of a siddha. So in other words, someone who's directly had full experience of Bhagavan's Madhurya, for them there's no scope for doubt or question or anything. They've directly experienced a, quote, higher taste, so they don't have interest in anything else. So for them to renounce something lower isn't necessarily an act of fortitude, because it's just it's just natural at that point, and it's something that's already within the scope of what's assured for them. But for someone who hasn't had that experience yet, but who's in the pursuit of that experience and living entirely upon the faith and conviction in the future reality of that experience, for them to make the rejection of other desirable objects simply on the strength of their faith, or simply on the strength of their conviction in their pursuit of that object, that is an act of fortitude. That is an act of valiance or strength, if you will. And so that's why he negates that this dynamic can refer to the case of a Siddha Bhakta. So this is a rare case where a sadhaka experiences a type of rasa that a Siddha doesn't. So it's a bit of an unusual category. But I think the concept is clear. So Dhruva fits this category well. Therefore, Sri Jiva further comments in regard to this verse, specifically that this statement of Dhruva is not based on complete experience of Sri Bhagavan's sweetness, since in Srimad Bhagavatam it is stated that he made such a statement only after being touched by Bhagavan's Panchajanya conch shell, and only later had full experience of Sri Bhagavan's sweetness. So when Dhruva had this darshan of Bhagavan, he's 5 years old, he doesn't know grammar, he doesn't know Sanskrit, he doesn't know how to even praise Bhagavan, but he's feeling this desire to do so. So understanding that, Bhagavan touches him with his conch and gives him like an instant download of, knowledge of grammar and kavya and all of this, and then he can flow out and speak these praises and express his emotions and his heart to Bhagavan. But Jiva Gosvami is here saying that, therefore, because these statements that he made were, loaded with this download that came from Bhagavan, it wasn't that he had full realization of even what he's saying. And as we see, he then went and lived on Dhruvaloka and even was subject to some obstacles or some state of delusion later in life, and then ultimately only in a final later stage ascended to Vaikuntha and fully achieved his object. So, on the whole, the point of the discussion is that Dhruva, as a sadhaka, went through this process of shifting his motivation for his engagement in bhakti, and went from being motivated by one object to being motivated simply with the desire for service. And in the course of that shift of motivation, went through a great deal of repentance and dejection about not having come to acquire that clarity and accuracy or purity of desire from the beginning. So for persons who are, following the path of sadhana, then this can be a cause of reflection to consider, what is it that I desire? Why do I desire these byproducts or these side aspects or these Vaishnava society secondary features of, Vaishnava life that are desirable, and why can't I sincerely and wholly and fully simply desire the one goal that I claim to be pursuing? And this type of reflection and this type of ethic towards one-pointedness will be a healthy influence in the life of a sadhaka. Another way that this is emphasized is in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. As we see in the journey of Gopakumar, he initially, in as kind of an innocent manner, out of desire to serve more, thinks, if I became a king, I could serve more. If I became Indra, I could serve more. If I became Brahma, I could serve more. And then he, achieves these different positions, but then in every position that he achieves, still finds that his desire is unsatiated. But, as he goes up, then at one point Sanatana Gosvami makes is that at the point where he's riding the chariot for the first time to go beyond the entire Brahmanda and out of the world of samsara into Vaikuntha, then that time as he's going up in the chariot, he doesn't go up like he went to Svarga or up like he went to Brahmaloka. He goes way faster on a way higher trajectory, like he's taking off to a way more distant destination. And as he's doing so, then all these devas and other residents of these higher lokas are coming out and throwing flowers and worshipping him and adoring him as this incredibly highly accomplished spiritual aspirant. And so this is, you could say, a moment of glory. He's being adored by the most exalted, wise, famous, beautiful, people who are in the most desirable positions that you could be within the world. But it says, what Sanatana Gosvami writes, is that as all of this is happening, Gopakumar feels ashamed to look back and see that. And then in the Tika, he gives the reason. He says, Grinas padatvat. He says, because now that entire realm and all of the things within it and all of the objects that he previously was interested in all appear abominable to him. In other words, he feels, ashamed to have ever had attachment to any of it. So the intensity of the desire that these bhaktas have for Bhagavan, for the service of Bhagavan, becomes intense to that extent, that what people spend innumerable lifetimes from beginningless time constantly running after, with no concept and heavy resistance to even accepting the idea that there could be something more. Ultimately, these bhaktas feel that to have had any trace of attachment to any of that, or the totality of that, even after having experienced the best that it could ever be, ultimately feels like a complete source of embarrassment and a complete source of, having involved oneself in something that is entirely undesirable. So thus, there's a sense of dejection, and a heavy sense of repentance in the course of refining what it is that one ultimately aspires to. And that, recalibration of the mind, so to speak, is very necessary in the life of a sadhaka, and it's largely driven by experiences more so than theory. So these type of experiences of getting what it is that one desires and experiencing it to be unfulfilling, the more one can learn and not again desire something lesser the better, but nevertheless it's the experiences of getting the things and then finding them to be unfulfilling that will greatly fortify one's resolve to remain fixated upon what is truly the most ultimate object of aspiration, namely Bhagavan Bhakti. So all of this analysis is presented in the Bhagavatamrita, here in the Sindhu, there in the commentaries on Bhagavatam, the Bhagavatam itself, for the purpose of guiding spiritual aspirants about what to want and what desire to foster in their heart of hearts and what not to, and to be very careful, thoughtful, and precise in what it is that they aspire for, and very, you could say, callous in the one-pointed pursuit of that object. So this topic finishes here, and from where we'll get to in the next class, all this discussion that we've had for the last 30-something verses in the chapter about why bhakti is the abhideya, more or less this topic finishes here. And then it comes to how an individual then enters that path, and what are the stages that unfold, what is the eligibility required, etc. All of that, you could say, next level, more immediately practical aspects of this path begin in the beginning of that discussion comes from the following verse, which we'll get to in the next reading. So I'll stop here for today. If anyone has comments, corrections, questions, feedback of any other type, feel free to share. Yes, I see the first hand.
Was that me, I think, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Pranam Shri Krishna Dasa. My question, I guess, is, I guess it, in kind of brief form, it's, did all of Dhruva Maharaja's desirousness for a kingdom and so forth during his period of sadhana, did that ultimately prevent him from ever attaining the highest attainment, or did it merely delay it? Like, in other words, like after the final dissolution, after his kingdom within the material world was dissolved eventually, did he then attain the highest attainment of service to Bhagavan's feet, or was his attainment then still tainted by his desires?
He definitely did achieve that, and it was initially at this time when he was given this other object that he felt this dejection, repentance, etc. But for the most part, he spent his long life engaged in, service to Bhagavan with the peace of mind that that service was itself everything to him. The goal, the means was all one, and he, lived the life of an exalted pure bhakta, to the extent that we hear later in the Bhagavatam that his bhakti was considered so pure that even at the time of his death couldn't touch him. So it said that he was sitting in his hut doing bhajan, and then suddenly he could see someone was like waiting outside the hut, and he looks, and it's Yamaraj, or it's death personified, like politely sitting like a guest in a waiting room, and then he's like, oh, what have you come here for? And he's like, oh, well, your body. And then he said, oh, is it the time of my death? Okay, take it, let's go. And he said, no, I can't. If I could, I would have taken your body already a while ago. I've been sitting here waiting. But your whole body has become surcharged with this divine shakti of bhakti to such an extent, I can't even put my hand on you. Oh, really? Is it like that? Yeah, it's like that. Okay. And then at that time, this airplane comes down from Vaikuntha, and these Vaikuntha Dutas say, okay, now Bhagavan is calling you, let's go. So then Dhruva's thinking, okay, well, I got to give my body to him, and it's time to go to Vaikuntha. And then Yamaraj says, okay, here, look, I've got the solution. I'll go bow down and put my head at the base of the ramp into the airplane. And as you step onto the ramp, step on my head. And by touching my head, I will then take, your body off of you, and you can go in the same stride into the plane and up onto Vaikuntha. So then Dhruva is said to be a rare case where he actually ascended into Vaikuntha in the same body, or his body didn't actually drop like Narada's body is said to have dropped in the first canto, but he stepped on the head and his body instantaneously in its same exact appearance morphed into a spiritual body, and that spiritual body just kept walking like as if an onlooker wouldn't have noticed any difference. But his material body was, sucked out, so to speak, by Yamaraj, and then he went off to Vaikuntha happily ever after. So, no doubt Dhruva is supremely worshipable as a Param Bhakta, but that glorious ascent, so to speak, was long in the waiting. And that, he got saddled with that, in one sense desirable, in one sense undesirable position of ruling over the vault of heaven, or what they call Dhruva Loka, because of this initial separate desire that he had.
Yeah, I mean, it's reassuring to me that he eventually, I understand why he was repenting at first, that his desires had gotten him kind of to some degree stuck with a position when he could have attained service to Bhagavan's feet in a more, within Vaikuntha sooner. But I don't know, I still find the story of Dhruva Maharaj somewhat reassuring. It's because, it's like, because Bhagavan's not going to show up and be like, okay, well, you've done a little bit of bhakti, so I'm going to rip you away from your desires and force you, to do this service that you don't really want to do. He really waits until, until the bhakta is actually ready for pure bhakti to grant pure bhakti. You know what I mean? If there's even a little bit of desire for something else, he'll let you get the other desire. Well, in some cases. Well, I guess this goes back to what I don't really know what I'm saying. Never mind. But I don't know. I find this story. I guess I know I'm supposed to interpret the story of Dhruva Maharaj as sort of a warning, but I'm kind of finding it reassuring instead of a warning. I don't know if that's bad or not.
Sure. I mean, Bhagavan knows very well how to take care of his bhaktas and how to bring people along the path towards him according to the specific condition of their individual mind. And that will be unique to every single individual's journey. No two persons' karma is the same. No two persons' circumstances are the same. No two people's journeys will be the same. Ironically, people seem to like to think that spirituality means joining some group and following some formula that a bunch of other people are doing and force-fitting themselves into some factory concept of how to become pure or perfect. But actually, the process by which anyone will ultimately realize this highest thing is completely unique to their personal, psychological, karmic circumstances, and the ultimate outcome that they can achieve can also be and will also be completely unique based on what it is that they aspire to and whatever grace that Bhagavan in his infinite wisdom wishes to bestow upon them. So, how to, slice, dice, soak, marinate, cook, fry, how to get it just right, ultimately to be relishable. Bhagavan knows what he's doing very well, and he knows how to bring people along. So there is a certain way to see this unfolding as something very assuring and an expression of Bhagavan's care for the bhakta. That is also certainly a thread that can be traced in this discussion.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yep, next hand.
Pranam Baba. In this section of Sanatana Gosvami's Shiksha for Abhideya, I'm just trying to, my question is kind of answered in the tail end of the last question, but I'm just trying to see how Dhruva, how he attained this nishkama to, let go of his desires. I mean, when he was 5 and he met by grace Narada Muni, and even though he was given instruction, don't take those insults seriously, but he still harbored that desire even after meeting Narad, and went through all these austerities, and then later on meeting Bhagwan. When you consider how the process that how he attained this niskama, someone might misinterpret and say, oh, well, I have to do a lot of austerity to get to but I mean, or was it the mantra, or was it the grace of meeting Narad? How are we to take it as sadhakas? Well, I understand that, okay, we should not harbor any material desires while performing bhakti. But when you see Dhruva, he was not given much jnana when he was given the mantra. Sorry, could you follow what I was saying?
So what's your question ultimately?
So the question is that the process that's being shown here, because it is abhideya, so the instruction is not to harbor any desires while doing bhakti. Is that correct? That is the main teaching, shiksha of Sanatana Gosvami here. Is that correct?
Sanatana Gosvami is receiving teachings from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is quoting this verse to illustrate the point that he makes, that someone who takes up worship with another desire ultimately gives up that other desire and desires only to be a servant, or desires only to do bhakti. That's the specific context that's being stated. So the broader theme in the chapter is that bhakti is the abhideya. So now that is being fortified by this idea that if someone takes up the path of bhakti, even for another purpose, they'll end up still achieving the ultimate goal of bhakti, because bhakti is such a wonderful or powerful abhideya that it even curves or corrects those who take it up for another purpose into pursuing it for its own sake. That's the conceptual unfolding in the Caritamrta itself. So in this discussion today, I've brought in some elements from the Bhagavatam, from other commentaries, which fortify that idea of how this shift in the sadhaka's desire from the other object that they were initially motivated by into the desire for bhakti alone, or for Bhagavan alone, is sustained. So that was the purpose of looking at the whole dejection and repentance and so forth that Dhruva went through, because it illustrates how one who took up this path of bhakti ultimately desires only bhakti itself. So then, as an overtone or as a broader subject of reflection, one can also see this as, a set of guidelines or an example for how one should be clear in what one aspires to as a sadhaka oneself. And we can say, blessed to have the chance to study these texts, to learn from gurus who know these teachings, in order to, in whatever stage or level of sadhana anyone may be in, to have this knowledge that, as you pointed out, Dhruva, as a 5-year-old boy who ran off into the forest, having just heard a few words from his mother and his stepmother, and didn't necessarily sit down and study Shastra systematically, had, the chance to reflect on and consider the, viability or how intelligent it might be to be so intent upon the desire that he had. It's a great fortune to be able to take time to contemplate what is really worthy of desiring and have a set of guidance as we get in these texts about what truly is worthy of aspiring for. And that can lead to a highly efficient approach in the life of a fortunate, Vaishnava or aspiring Vaishnava, whereby without putting a huge amount of effort into the pursuit of a goal that ultimately isn't fulfilling, one can acquire a clear understanding of what is truly worthy of aspiring for and direct themselves to that more efficiently, or without having spent as much time or gone through as much austerity as Dhruva Maharaj did. Does that address what you wanted to discuss?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, then I'll cap it here for today, and we'll continue this discussion in the next reading. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.